early data suggests that there's a lot of this expanding human agency, expanding human ability, expanding capabilities. Another recent paper finds that humans are actually working longer hours in some cases with AI because there's more they can get out of it. Those two things, the pace of change and the capabilities, I think are reasons why economists need to be paying attention to this. And this is one of the reasons I joined OpenAI, so I can get as close to it as I can. You said it right. I mean, if we don't invest in the grid and make sure that we can provide reliable, clean, renewable energy where we can in terms of powering AI and the data centers that make it possible both for training and inference, we're not going to be able to maintain our lead.
Hi, everyone. This is the Tech Surge Deep Tech Podcast presented by Celesta Capital. Each episode, we spotlight issues and voices at the intersection of emerging technologies, company building, and venture investment. I am Sriram Viswanathan, founding managing partner at Celesta Capital. If you enjoy Tech Surge, now is a perfect time to hit the like and subscribe button. And while you're at it, you can leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. If you're just discovering us, visit techsurgepodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter and check out the archive of some very interesting past episodes. So we're very pleased to welcome Ronnie Chatterji to the podcast today. Ronnie, you're currently the chief economist at OpenAI, but prior to this role, you've had an incredibly impressive career in academics and in public policy and in the government. You've been a distinguished professor of business and public policy at Duke for many years. You also served as the economic advisor in the Obama administration and in the Biden administration. And more recently, you were helping the whole global supply chain strategy during the pandemic, as well as the much talked about CHIPS Act, which is really a major policy initiative. And it'd be really good to sort of understand what you think with the new administration and the effectiveness and the seriousness of that policy that the prior administration did, which was close to $50 billion plus. And now you've stepped into something very, very exciting, which is your role at the center of AI disruption, which we want to talk to you about, which is your role at OpenAI. So, Ronnie, it's a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to talk to you. So welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me. It is an honor to be here. And I like these kind of conversations with people who have made a huge impact in finance and technology and building companies. It's so exciting for me because I learn a ton from these. And I just want to say, very familiar, obviously, with your career and your company and what you've done around the world. So I think we're going to have a great time and looking forward to diving into these topics.
Yeah, wonderful. All right, well, let's jump right into it because there's so much interesting vectors that we can take this conversation with. As I said, we have to obviously talk about your current role, but I want to also spend a bit of time on just overall the economic implication of the advancement of AI and adoption of AI, and from a regulatory standpoint, how countries should be thinking about it. And then we'll obviously touch on, as I said, talk about the CHIPS Act and what the country really needs to bring back semiconductor supremacy that we've always had. But I think if I were to just step back and look at the, high-level priorities of someone like OpenAI working on, fundamental research and the implication of the products that the company brings to the market in economic terms, I would think that there are probably two or three, sort of long poles in the tent, if it were. One is obviously looking at the AI safety, the whole implication of what AI can do. Is it safe? Is it safe for all age groups? Is it safe for all kinds of jobs and so on and so forth? And what it could potentially do to humanity itself. That's a big target-rich segment. And the second is what you said, which is the economic implication of jobs and labor retraining and all of that. And the third is really the underlying debate around whether AI is more like electricity, which is a utility for everybody. And then how to regulate it, how to incentivize people to build more of that infrastructure and so on and so forth. So these are three kind of different things is how I think about it. Does this make sense to you as the three most important things that someone would want to focus on?
It's a great way to think about it. And I think that I'm squarely, at least in my initial work, in that middle bucket of thinking about, okay, how is this going to affect the job market? How is it going to affect GDP? How are we going to see this work through organizations in the public and private sector? But to your point, I think it's a really great way of framing it. That has implications for the other two categories you mentioned, right? When you think about the way that intelligence can be used to support workers, you're also going to start to think about some of those safety issues you mentioned, things that are not directly in my purview, but I spend a lot of time collaborating with colleagues across the organization. And to your other point about kind of how AI shows up in the world, how it interacts with the rule of law, our public sector institutions, to make sure that everyone gets access to this. Because at the end of the day, and this was kind of interesting to me, joining OpenAI, benefiting all humanity. That's the real mission. People take it very seriously, no matter where they are in the organization. I take it seriously. And that last piece is key to making sure that this intelligence revolution benefits all of humanity. So again, other people are working quite a bit on initiatives like Stargate or working with other countries in terms of what the rules of the game are around AI. But economics is a big part of that. So I see my role really in that middle bucket that you mentioned, branching out and supporting the work of the others in those areas.
I got it. So OpenAI recently published this whole economic blueprint for the U.S. and making policy recommendations. I assume that came from you or your inputs, pretty significantly, I assume.
I mean, I'll credit a large group across the organization, the Global Affairs group for this. But I think a lot of this just, it's Economics 101 updated for a new generation. But there are some differences. I think in the past, and this reflects some of the work I did, in policy, we sort of had this idea that, the market will ultimately decide where things are located. Let's say the production of semiconductor chips or where artificial intelligence is developed. And we really don't care where stuff is sort of located geographically as long as we can trade and have access to it. But in a world where geopolitics matters a lot more than it has for a long time, a lot of those economic theories need to be revisited. And I often say to people, Econ 101 said, just make the chips or train the models wherever it's cheapest. Econ 102, though, says that if that's geographically concentrated in one part of the world where you might not always have access to it, it can have really significant externalities, to use the econ term, right? Impact on your national security. And that's where I think we connect some of these topics. And that's an area where I think a lot of economists are starting to spend a lot more time on. That economic blueprint is a way to think about, hey, here's why we have to invest in AI infrastructure in countries to make sure that we have access to the cutting edge models and the inference that provides to provide intelligence for all the applications. And that's sort of one of the reasons I think that was really important.
Yeah, I mean, this is I can see exactly why the folks at OpenAI would have found your background and sort of working on CHIPS Act and sort of looking at another major technology development that has national security concerns, TSMC, blah blah blah. All of that would become extremely relevant. But let's talk about this economic gains. Any AI researcher or a developer or any company that is working remotely on AI, can't stop talking about all the greatest economic potential, but very seldom, or not as much, they spend time talking about the negative impact to really labor. So can you talk about what are the tangible gains you expect from AI, which can be labor accretive or at least labor enhanceable versus things that are labor disruptive? Healthcare, I can see how there's lots of interesting possibilities. Education, there are lots of great possibilities. Manufacturing, not so sure, right? So can you elaborate on where do you see labor accretion versus labor disruption with AI?
It's something I've been thinking about a lot. So let's start with some of the opportunities and the positive, and then we can pivot then and talk to some of the other issues which are really important and need to be confronted as well. On the opportunity side, when you look as an economist at the history of technology, the easiest thing to say and to see is technologies often emerge as a complement rather than a substitute to human labor when it is introduced. And in cases where it has substituted, we've moved on to higher margin, higher value jobs. You start with, like you mentioned, I think electricity and the steam engine and the internet and the integrated circuit. You look through these different technological changes and you read what people were thinking about at the time. And the idea of how they would be used and how they would enhance human sort of productivity weren't always well understood. We had to figure it out with the integrated circuit, for example, after it was invented, before it made its way into the calculator and made its way into all these different applications. When you think about AI, the first thing looking at technological history is it'll be a complement for human labor. And if you look at the early studies, and there's now been a few peer-reviewed studies coming out from economists, some sociologists, some technologists on how AI is being used at work and what individuals are doing with it. If you look at like a large consumer goods company or professional services, they're finding pretty big productivity increases for humans, 20% on order of that in terms of the tasks they're doing. And I think this is really interesting, but also quite expected in terms of how technology has been manifested in the workforce for a long time. I mean, you know this, but in the turn of the century, 1900s, I should say, the 20th century, most of the American workforce was in agriculture. And then we had a technological revolution in that sector. And you've seen this time and time again. And now 2% of Americans work in agriculture. But the other workers, right, the ones who aren't in that sector anymore, are working in other jobs. And our GDP has risen, and we produce more food than ever before. So for an economist, I'm thinking, well, look, the early data suggests that there's a lot of this expanding human agency, expanding human ability, expanding capabilities. Another recent paper finds that humans are actually working longer hours in some cases with AI because there's more they can get out of it. So that's what I'm seeing on the early studies. We'll talk in a second about whether that will persist and how to think about it. But that point of view is very consistent with economic theory, consistent with how we thought about technology, and consistent with big productivity increases in the economy. Economists, I'll stop here. They're all over the place in terms of the economic benefits predictions business. Economists, they say, they always have on one hand and on the other hand. Harry Truman, the president, he famously asked, can I just get a one-handed economist who tells me one thing? That's not how our deal works. I apologize to President Truman and everyone else who expected that. But look, economists have predictions that are on the lower end. Daron Acemoglu, Nobel Prize winner, has a more modest prediction about how much AI will affect the economy. You see other estimates that are much larger. But even the lower end estimates are still quite significant in terms of tens of billions and hundreds of billions of dollars of economic activity. And so I think you're starting to see the seeds of that in how it's being applied across the economy. And I expect it to be a big contributor to economic growth going forward, but it'll probably be unevenly distributed in terms of which countries, which industries. And that's been true of every kind of technology. That's what we've been seeing so far with the peer-reviewed research and also the economic forecast. I'll stop there just to see if you have a follow-up and I can talk about some of the other stuff.
I think you bring up a very good point. It's good to hear from an economist that this is really still very early stages of the evolution of this technology, and nobody has the clear answer to the true implications of this. But there are some very the pace at which things have gone about is what is scary about this transition, right?
Yes.
And in fact, you have young kids. You have much younger kids than I do, but I have a 30-year-old, and he's in the working age. But if there was somebody in high school or in college today, I'm hard pressed to tell them what they should focus on, because if you read what Meta puts out, or even OpenAI puts out, or Google puts out, they expect 70 to 80 to 90% of all the code that gets written by these companies to be written by AI. So, why do you need 100,000 people in Meta anymore? Why do you need 100,000 people in Google anymore? This is not, 10 years out problem. This is the next 3-year out problem. So what do those people do? And, are we equipped to be able to sort of retrain these people? And are there enough jobs for them to do other things that are AI supplementable and accretive to the overall value creation? How do you think about that?
It's a great question. And I do start from my own kids, like you said. And when they think, hey, what do I want to be when I grow up? And a couple things. And I think your point is well taken. Like economists, we think about this in terms of the data we have in front of us and technological history and what we learned from those other studies. What is unique about AI, and I think I try to bring this up in every talk, and I learned this from OpenAI and researchers at OpenAI, this time is different in many dimensions. And one of those differences is speed. ChatGPT got to 100 million users in 2 months. And if I compare this to all my wonderful examples that I'll show researchers here and other people about the integrated circuit or electricity or the steam engine, that's a lot faster. And there still will be an adjustment period, like this in-between times, as Professor Ajay Agarwal at Toronto calls it. That in-between times will still exist before AI gets put into that killer app, like something like ChatGPT. But really, that's a really rapid pace. The second thing that's different is the capabilities of the model, and that's what you referenced. I mean, if you look at the benchmarks that we are saturating with these models, how quickly we are achieving those goals, it's moving much faster than it was 5 or 10 years ago. Those two things, the pace of change and the capabilities, I think, are reasons why economists need to be paying attention to this. And this is one of the reasons I joined OpenAI, so I could get as close to it as I can. And that is creating a lot of uncertainty, excitement for some, anxiety for others about what the job market's going to look like this year, next year, and otherwise. For my kids, I think the other thing, and if people who have college-age kids will know this well, there's other macro and structural economic factors that have made the job market more difficult. Like the internship market wasn't that great last year, and there's a lot of uncertainty this year for kids who are thinking about internships. And people haven't quit their jobs as quickly, so the hiring has kind of slowed down, separate from AI. So I would say there's lots of things going on that create that anxiety, including fears about new technologies. When I talk to my kids, I say, look, when I was young, my parents just gave me really a few options of what to do with my life. And my parents maybe more, the typical immigrant story. There's two choices, right? Like, either medicine or engineering. And if you're creative, you can become a biomedical engineer, right? Something like this. My parents were more open than that, and I became an economist. But still, there was a limited number of things that seemed practical and right. That was based on their projection of the future. I will say, medicine changed a lot from when I was a kid to where it is now. Engineering changed a lot from when I was a kid to where it is now. So the idea that we could ever precisely point and say, this is what you should do. It's the old Dustin Hoffman. We're old enough to talk about this in the Graduate, where he says, plastics. It's going to be plastics. That idea, I would say, it's a little bit of looking through the past through rose-colored lenses. We didn't have perfect precision even then. Second, I think a lot of the work that gets created is going to be stuff we can't even describe. If I told you your kid would be an influencer, 10 years ago, you'd say, Ronnie, what is that? Define that. And we find that in the data. Like a lot of stuff that was in the census in 1940, we have jobs today that didn't even exist. We didn't know what to call them, right? So I think we should also expect, as humans always have, particularly in the United States of America, we're going to create new work, new categories, which we might not be able to know exactly. Given all that, how do you prepare your kids? There's a couple things. I think critical thinking is still going to be important. I've seen this technology up close. I'm a professor, of course, too, so I've thought about it in the classroom. I still think critical thinking is going to be such an important part of how we interact with intelligence. And those who are developing their skills to be the best complement to AI are going to be really, really successful. People often joke, is AI going to take my job? And I kind of joke back. I say, well, no, someone using AI better than you is more likely to do that than AI. I think there's a lot to that. Critical thinking and complementing AI. Second thing I'll say is I still think financial sort of numeracy and being able to be good with numbers will be really important. We don't introduce the calculator in math education until later. Kids learn the fundamentals, and they still should. And they still might want to major in engineering subjects or learn how to code, not because they're necessarily going to do that at their job the majority of the time, but there are many, many engineers who now are CEOs of major companies not doing engineering day to day. That way of thinking, that skill set, whether it's engineering or philosophy, can be really useful even if you're not actually doing that in your job. And so I would encourage my kids to focus on those skills like that, push forward, and they're going to have to develop a resilience and a neuroplasticity to be ready for all the changes that are going to happen. And I'm going to try my best to guide them, but a lot of it's going to be things that even I can't expect.
Well, the interesting thing is that I saw this report that said that maybe it's someone at OpenAI who said that, let me look at the various prompts that people have, put in for GPT, and they can guess the age of the person that's, putting those prompts in. Because as you said, people that are more tuned to sort of understanding how to use the tool or inherently have a, bigger advantage. But I want to sort of talk about this. In your report, you talk about this notion of an economic zone, where there are these regional AI hubs, and someone once said that the future is already here; it's just unevenly distributed, and that is so true. If you brought somebody from South Dakota or some inner parts of India, whatever, and they were in San Francisco, they would go crazy about what are these cars self-driving and all of that, right? So if there's an economic zone that is not as tuned to adoption of high-end technology, how do you ensure that this technology is accessible to them? And is that one of the key areas that the economic impact that AI could have could get greatly benefited by what you do with these zones?
No, I mean, first of all, I'm from North Carolina, and I still get wowed by self-driving cars. So I'm with you on this, and the future is here. It's already here, unevenly distributed. I think that, I mean, this is an animating feature of the entire organization, and it includes the economic research team. And, someone like me, one of the advantages of being a slightly older guy in the company, I should joke, like talking mostly to 20-year-olds around the office, is I've seen this movie before, right? I grew up in the age of the internet. I remember having like a dial-up internet connection with American Online, and I saw the rise of Google search, and learned how to use Microsoft Office products. I've seen all that, and I remember during those technological transformations, there was a lot of talk about digital divide. That was an old word that we used to use, referring to like the gap in internet access. And then we talked about sort of access to high-speed broadband as being like another divide. Each technological revolution opened up these divides that in some ways exacerbated inequality, depending on which study you look at and how you think about it. And there's this conviction here that we cannot let that happen again. One, because we think that AI is going to have such a big impact on the way people live and work. So if it's unevenly distributed, it can exacerbate existing sort of inequalities in income and wealth, which are serious here in the United States, but also around the world.
Yeah, but what are you, if I may, what are you really proposing that the government, what is the role of the government or the state governments to actually not have this sort of peaks and valleys of adoption, if you will, and have a more uniform sort of adoption of this technology? What do they do?
It's got to start with adoption in the public sector and in educational institutions. When you think about it, like I went to public school growing up. What gave me the opportunity to use different software, different hardware? It was available in my school, and I had great teachers who were building lessons plans around it and working with it. I got to use it. And at the extreme level, the Malcolm Gladwell's book about like the 10,000 hours, Bill Gates got a chance, right, to live near a center where they had a really high performing computer, and he got to put in the time. We have to make sure that people have access to actually use these tools. And you're seeing the government of Estonia just announced like a big deal to use AI across the economy. They did the same thing back with the internet. So I think the role of the government is to make sure that both in the public sector and in the education system, and hopefully among their firms in their country, that you're seeing more adoption and experimentation with these tools. If you don't see that, you're more likely, I think, to see a have and have not situation where the companies and the countries and the institutions that are getting to know this, they're doing the prompt engineering you're talking about, getting familiar with it, unlocking things they couldn't do before, they're going to get better and better, faster and faster, driving those divides. And so that's where I see it to be really, really important. How you do it, how you do the rollouts, how you incorporate it, that's got to be the decision of political leaders and other folks. But I would say making sure your people are trying this stuff, very important. And I saw that as we talked about before. I saw that when we went to India, just how many people are using it in India and what a priority is for the government to get more people to use it.
Yeah, I want to get to India and China in a bit. But before we do that, in the old days when broadband penetration was very low, there was this huge initiative to sort of push for greater broadband adoption. There were lots of, the famous Telecom Reform Act was there, and uniform access and all of that. So you've actually called for a National Transmission Highway Act to fast track transmission of infrastructure, including AI. How critical is upgrading our energy and internet backbone important for AI growth? And so help us understand, how where are we in that continuum, if you will, of let's say 5 years of infrastructure development? Where are we in that journey to get uniform access for AI?
I think we're at a critical phase. Like it has to start now. And I think you've said it right. I mean, if we don't invest in the grid and make sure that we can provide reliable, clean, renewable energy where we can in terms of powering AI and the data centers that make it possible both for training and inference, we're not going to be able to maintain our lead. I mean, you talked about it, San Francisco is this amazing place for AI. There's like 800 startups in AI. There's companies like OpenAI. Of course, the United States is benefiting a lot from that. But we will only be able to keep that lead and keep these organizations vibrant if we invest in these assets. And it has to be, to your point, about benefiting all of humanity and sort of distributing the benefits across the country. And the great thing is there's different places that have different attributes to make that possible. So you're seeing different states step up and embrace that. I think it's important. I think it's a critical phase. I think it has to happen now. And the good thing about it too, I mean, speaking as someone who worked in government, is I see a lot of bipartisan agreement about investments in infrastructure. One of the nice things, having worked on the CHIPS Act, that was the kind of investment that people said, look, this makes sense. Whether I'm a Republican or a Democrat, whether I'm interested in politics or not, making more chips in the United States, making sure we can make stuff again, and making sure those fabs have the right energy and the right workforce. It just seems to make economic sense. And I sort of see like these AI infrastructure investments as similar. And to your point, probably one of the reasons that like this opportunity made a lot of sense for me, because I was already looking at the world through this lens where I felt like the United States needed to make these big investments. And I think AI is just part of that stack that we started building back when I was in government service.
Yeah. So we should pivot to the whole geopolitics since you alluded to it. You just came back from India as well. OpenAI has submitted a proposal to the government for the US AI action plan and a bunch of recommendations. And there are lots of concerns about China's ascent in AI. And people have seen the sort of the semiconductor movie, and they don't like the ending of being dependent on one tiny island and one large company. So how does one react if you are recommending to the U.S. government with your economist hat and being part of OpenAI? CCP is determined to overtake the U.S. in AI by 2030. So can you talk about that and some of China's strategic advantages to be able to get there? And what does the U.S. need to do in response or in anticipation of that?
Yeah, I'll talk about it just based on my expertise as an economist. I mean, there are so many experts more well-versed than me on the geopolitics of it all and national competition. A personal reflection is like when I learned economics, I immediately got interested in the economics of innovation. And I thought, wow, nothing more important than innovation. And I recognized in my training that like innovation is why countries grow. And investing in the people and the infrastructure to make innovations in drug discovery or material sciences or AI is really one of the reasons the United States is where it is today. And I wanted to understand that process. But in those discussions, when I was in grad school at Berkeley, geopolitics was kind of in the background. We lived in a very stable geopolitical context. And at least in terms of great power competition between countries, the U.S. was the sort of the undisputed economic and national security powerhouse during most of the time that I was studying economics. Now, what you see, we're entering an era where there's more sort of great power rivalry on the horizon, and also other nations, like you might call them swing states. India is one of them. The UAE, KSA, Nigeria, all these other countries, right? And of course, many European countries in the UK are coming out and saying, okay, what is our role in this new world? And that creates a real national imperative, in my personal view, in the United States around economic competitiveness. And so as an economist, I can speak and say, look, the reason I think the CHIPS Act and now sort of investing in AI infrastructure makes sense is because the United States is going to want to make sure for this transformative technology that's going to really shape our economic futures globally, that the United States has an important role and a leading role. And the way we do that is have the best AI researchers at places like OpenAI, but you also have to have the compute. You also have to have the energy. You also have to have the ecosystem and the right kind of education system. All those things need to be in place. And so, at least from an economics point of view, I think we need to be thinking about it strategically and making sure the U.S. is the leader. As that relates to our relationships with other countries and how this works. And that's probably beyond a geopolitical strategist for someone like me. But in general, I think that makes good sense for the United States to invest in those things. And we're going to have to work together with partners and allies to achieve those goals too. And that's a really important job for folks in government and out too.
That's kind of what I'm trying to get to, because if you were to compare what's happening in AI with, let's say, the transportation industry or the communication industry, you could make the argument that cross collaboration between various countries was essential for reaping the full benefits of those two, huge innovations. And today you can jump on a plane and, go from San Francisco to wherever, and any number of countries that you cross, there is a common system to actually manage the safety and the transportation, much like what you have to do when you make a phone call. There is some organization that actually makes sure your call actually is, there's roaming and settlement and all of that. Is there a model like that? Or do you see a need for something like that for AI? Because today it feels like, every country is spending gazillion dollars in infrastructure, but there is really no coordinated effort, not just on AI development, but AI usage across multiple countries. Do you see a need for that? And if so, is there a model that you think that one might follow to ensure that maximum adoption of this?
I think number one, we do need collaboration across the entire world. And I'll use the analogy with climate. When we face global challenges, we need to work together, partners, allies, and rivals to make sure that we can get to where we need to go. And I think with AI, that's also true. And if you just look at you and me and our background, look at the researchers at OpenAI, it also means that having people from all over the world or heritage that comes from all over the world is really important to coming out to like the best ideas. The one thing I'll say though is I think sometimes we paint it in a very binary way. People say, oh, well, if we're doing this in terms of sort of building economic competitiveness, we're not doing the other thing. I think actually we can collaborate and compete on different dimensions. It's harder, but when I worked in government, we were at times, right, obviously competing, but we also kept, and it's the same is true as this in this administration, we kept dialogues open with everyone around the world, right? And that's really important. And even, let's say, in an era of relationships between the US and the Soviet Union, you had track two and other kinds of dialogues that were happening to make sure that we were talking about the future of really important technologies. And I think, while that isn't perfect, right? We do have models from those prior eras, and we're going to have to build new ones to make sure we can collaborate, even when we might be disagreeing on other issues. So I actually feel pretty confident, especially given sort of the capabilities of our governments and also the vitality of our private sector, I should say, in civil society, to be able to have two conversations at once. I don't think it needs to be an either or. And I think that when you talk to researchers at a place like OpenAI, this idea of like collaboration being really important for safety resonates quite a bit. And as an economist, I see the same things. We got to get it right. It's not going to be easy. There's no silver bullet or script, but we have to be able to do both if we're going to succeed.
Yeah. But that actually brings up two important questions. I think the EU has created this most comprehensive framework for AI regulation. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, is it helpful to the overall case for AI, or is it going to slow it down, or what's your thought on what EU is trying to do?
Yeah, I mean, look, coming back from London, Paris, Brussels, and I'll go back. I mean, I think I see two things. One, policymakers there are really trying to make a concerted effort in the EU and the UK to understand how AI is going to affect their economy. And so I think they're very conscious of the idea of like, this is going to be a big deal. And they want to make sure that they're not left behind in those areas. And they have a lot of talent and a lot of important assets as relates to AI. So they want to make sure that those are leveraged and utilized. But they also want to make sure that the regulatory environment matches their values and the beliefs of their citizens. And they're trying to get that balance right. The worry, of course, is that like if we continue to develop these models and advance the applications in other places, but it's not happening in some parts of the world because of regulation, that those places will be left behind. And they're trying to get that balance right. We try to work constructively with them. There are many other folks on the team who are really deep on this. But for me, I just try to say, look, here's the impact of AI in the economy. Here's what it can happen. Here's how it can affect your firms. Here's what I think adoption matters. And in each country, they're going to have to decide what kind of framework they want, what rules of the game they want to make that happen. I do think you're seeing tremendous growth in the United States right now. We're the home of sort of the major AI labs. You're seeing all these startups. There's a reason for that. We've created an environment in the United States of America over many generations, Republican, Democrat, many administrations, that's really supportive of innovation and entrepreneurship. And I think we're reaping the benefits of that. So that's one model. There are surely others, but that's what I think is really interesting for me as I have these conversations.
Yeah, but that's great that you brought it back to the US, because from an economist perspective, you are absolutely right. Most of the leading AI labs and AI work is actually happening in the US. China has a lot of stuff going on, and some of it is known, some of it is not known. But in the US, is there a correct balance between regulation and innovation in AI? And do you think having 700 different state AI laws being introduced right now is the right way? Or do you think there's a need for and a push towards a national or international AI framework? I mean, what's the model? I mean, everybody, it's kind of like, let chaos reign and then reign in the chaos. Is that the approach that the government folks are taking right now? Or what do you think this is headed?
I mean, look, from an economics point of view, I can tell you, like, having clear sets of rules to follow is really, really important. And so, but I also think when new technologies come about, everyone's trying to understand them and participate in shaping the rules. I think like the one cool thing about OpenAI, and as the economist, I've just like learned this, like mostly people here are just focused on building amazing products. Like you don't build ChatGPT unless, people, like, you don't build a product like that unless you're really focused on like, what do people want to use this for? What are the fun, cool things? And I'm sure like you use it, you're seeing something new every day that you can do. So I think these are all important issues, but I think in the end, the company is very focused on research and sort of making an awesome product. I do expect, like, as AI develops, for sort of the rules of the game to be clarified, for us to have. We've done this in the United States before on so many different things. So I'm pretty confident. I think actually, like, letting policymakers work through their process, constructively working with them. We have so many people at OpenAI who are doing things like that. That to me, that's the best. That's the best way to go forward. And I'm very confident when it comes to the U.S. Just given I have context here, I've worked in government. We'll get to a good place because we've done it with technology in the past and managed to lead the world. That's how I'm seeing things, And I think that the more constructive we can be, great. But we really do have to focus on building amazing products. Really, everything depends on that.
Mm. So let's get back to the last big thing that you worked on, which is the CHIPS Act.
Yeah.
I mean, it's you've got a new job. There's a new administration.
Yeah.
The market dynamics seems to have changed quite dramatically. Some would say the CHIPS Act was great in its vision and strategy, but sort of bad in execution because that's just the nature of the beast. Administrations change and not everybody's bought into it. So before we get into the specifics, if you were to just step back and look at CHIPS Act, the vision and strategy, the actual implementation, so to date, and where is it headed in the future? Can you just elaborate, how do you see it?
Yeah, vision and strategy. I was one of the people who worked on like a strategy document outlining like what our goals were going to be. And I take a lot of pride in that work that was done, led by Secretary Gina Raimondo and the CHIPS office at the Commerce Department, and my participation from the White House at the National Economic Council with people like Brian Deese and Lil Brainerd. We tried to put out sort of a strategy that would give some goalposts that wouldn't be moved. I think one of the big challenges when you make these big investments, it's often called industrial policy around the world. Government makes a bunch of investments, they change the goalpost. People say, well, you didn't achieve your goals. And you say, well, no, they were different goals. I'm coming up with something new. No, we laid out what we want to see in the United States with leading edge clusters to make the most advanced chips, with R&D, with the role of memory, sort of with legacy and mature nodes. And so all those things were written down. And I think that was a really good thing because it kind of gave people a playbook and gave market participants an understanding. I think it's really important in the work we did. We also the timing, I think, was important. The AI revolution was kind of taking off in the public imagination around this time. And so, chips, right, GPU and memory chips are going to be really, really important in AI. And we kind of saw that. And it was good that we did the CHIPS Act when we did, given what happened with AI. And I think that's one of the reasons you had bipartisan support for it. It's something I'm really excited about. I know we live in times where people have big disagreements about politics, and that's a really important part of living in a democracy. I participate in that myself. But this is something that there was just a lot of bipartisan support because it just makes sense. And so I liked the vision, the strategy, bringing people together around what we were going to do. With implementation, we always knew it was going to be challenging because this is like a live market where you're bringing in $52 billion to build these huge facilities that take years to put together and bring the equipment in, workforce that hasn't been at this scale for a long time. And so those things, I think it is harder to predict. It also relies on the fortunes of companies, the ones involved in the industry, TSMC, Intel, Samsung. I think what you're seeing, though, is TSMC's projects in Arizona, Samsung's projects in Texas, R&D investments around the country, ranging from Indiana to Oregon and a lot of places in between. You're seeing a lot of big investments in semiconductors across the value chain. I think it's really good for the United States of America. As we transition from one administration to the other, that's always when you work in government, that you might be working on something, but then tomorrow someone else might be working on something and they might have a different viewpoint on it. But I think what you're seeing is, again, the bipartisan ethos of this is carrying forward because people really do care about making sure chips are made in the U.S. They might use different tools, I imagine. You've seen lots of discussions, and we'll see how it actually shapes up. I don't have any insight to that, but I feel pretty good about the decisions that we've made along the way and where we're going. And I think more broadly, the vision seems to be this is really important. And how we get there is going to be determined by each administration and how they implement it. But overall, feeling good about it. I think that you're not going to be able to replicate an entire supply chain in a country overnight. And so I never had this expectation that was going to happen very quickly. I do think it's really changed the conversation around chips, which is very important.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair way of representing what's happened to the CHIPS Act. And I completely agree with you that the vision and the strategy was well thought out. But, if you were to compare that to what's going on in AI, Microsoft announces, $80 billion investment, and OpenAI announces $100 billion. So it feels like, $15 billion is a lot of money, but it feels like in the AI landscape, it's Tuesday. Right?
Yeah, no, but even in the semiconductor fab landscape, it's a lot. It was money, but if you think about the capex of the economy, even that, right? And now AI, but I actually see the AI investment boom and this infrastructure boom as building on top of those investments from chips, meaning you are always going to have to leverage that $52 billion into a larger amount of capital investment from the private sector. And that happened. When I was there, around $300 billion of private sector investments were announced. So I kind of feel like these subsequent investment booms, I mean, they're not all because of the CHIPS Act. I wouldn't say that, but it's complementary to those investments.
But there's a slight difference, though, I think, in the way that government's role of providing incentives, whether it's solar infrastructure or EV or CHIPS Act or any of this, is where private capital doesn't naturally find it attractive enough to go into that large patient capital kind of an approach, and the government provides the incentive. In AI, it feels like everybody is putting money into AI, and some would argue that it's heavily hyped up and overvalued and all of that. But there's no dearth of capital. So given that, do you think that there is a case to be made for some sort of a sovereign push towards build out of AI infrastructure backed by public funds, or do you not see that?
I think so. I think you're making an important distinction. Like when you think about the CHIPS Act or other policies like that, the role of government, I think we're both in agreement, is to lay the foundation. That amount of money isn't going to solve the investment gap between the United States and other countries.
It's more of a carrot. It's an incentive.
It was a carrot, and it comes with a tax credit, of course, that was kind of creating more investment. All really, really important things. There's also investments in R&D, which is something that might not be funded as much by the private sector, left to their own devices. When it comes to AI, you're right. You're seeing massive private sector investment. Whether it is enough, though, to provide the compute we're going to need for the future, and whether that compute is going to be distributed enough to benefit all Americans, that's a good question. And that's where I think government will play an increasingly important role coming forward. So you are seeing massive investment numbers. And I think you're right to say, what's the right amount of investment? This is how markets work. But government's going to have an important role, I think, to lay the foundation to make sure those investments are working, are they in the right places, and they're benefiting people. And also to your point about the grid, you're going to need upgrades to the grid no matter what to support all this investment as well. So I do think you'll see a similar complementary relationship going forward, just the same way we envisioned when we think about something like the CHIPS Act. Now you think about it in the case of AI. But pleased to see all this investment and excited to see where it goes. Yes. I agree with you. Those are big numbers, incomprehensible to me. Yes.
That's exactly right. You've traveled a lot in your current role and even before. You've seen even firsthand what's going on in China. You've seen what's going on in India. What are you excited about these two geographies as it relates to AI? And is there something that we in the U.S. can learn from those two geographies?
I think the enthusiasm of the young populations. I mean, I'll speak for India. I just got back from there, right? I haven't visited that many other parts of Asia yet in my travels at OpenAI. But in India, I mean, gosh, I might get the number wrong, but I think it's like 1 million STEM graduates coming out every year or something. So when you see what did you say?
I said 1.4 million.
So like 1.4. And I felt like at this talk, maybe half of them were in line and we were talking because it was like amazing to see how many people were there. And every kid, right, was so excited about AI. And to be honest, I can say this to you. I mean, they knew more about AI than I do. These kids are super teched up, super smart, asking me all these questions like, wow. And I can only imagine what that 1.4 million looks like at scale. And so I think for Prime Minister Modi and the government, they're thinking, oh gosh, we have all this talent. How are we going to deploy them in the right way? And, looking at the enterprise software revolution of a decade or so ago or longer, a lot of the billion-dollar companies were built at the application layer. And I see a lot of Indians really interested in building applications on top of APIs like ours, doing amazing stuff. There's obviously also a lot of interest in building their own large language models. But I think what I'm seeing a lot of action, at least in terms of venture capital funding, companies started, is on the application verticals. And we both know India knows how to do that, right? They've proven that in the last generation of startups and companies they've scaled. So that was pretty much really exciting from the India trip, that the energy of the youth, how switched on they were about AI, and their dedication to pursue their interest through entrepreneurship and innovation. I mean, that's really good for the world. Obviously, it's really good for India. I think you'll see a lot of great companies come out there that are going to benefit people all over the world and transform India's economy if they get it right. So that was pretty exciting from my global trip.
So is there anything that, the second part of my question, is there anything that we can learn or do differently based on what you've observed in India?
Yeah, I think the optimism is really fun to see. I'm in a role right now where I hear a lot of excitement, but also a lot of anxiety. I think the excitement is often coming from young folks in other parts of the world who are saying, oh my gosh, this technology is like a leveler. This is going to let me do things I could not do before. And it's important not to lose that optimism. I also think there's anxiety. The job market's changing in ways people don't understand. I think about it for my own kids. I get that. The optimism, though, about like this could be something that could be good for us and good for opportunities is infectious. And I think that we can learn from it. I also think we need to think about the negative consequences. We need to track them. We need to figure out indicators. I don't want to paper that over, but that I think we can learn from that optimism and excitement about, hey, how can I build some cool products that can do things that we've never done before? You feel that vibe in India when you talk to young Indians graduating from college right now.
That's great. All right. Well, Ronnie, you're terrific. I think you give such a broad perspective on all the things that one has to be thinking about from a policy standpoint, from the economic impact and labor and all of that. So the last section, let's just do a fun,
Sure.
quick, lightning round of short questions to just get a perspective from you. So let's go here. What's the biggest misconception about AI today, in your view?
Oh, I think the biggest misconception is that it doesn't complement human flourishing and productivity. I think there's lots of cool things. I think I'm using it in my own life in ways that complement me. And what I mean by that in the economics terms, not that it gives me compliments. Since we're not doing captions here, I should be clear, right? Compliment meaning that it makes me better at the things I'm doing. Like I feel like when I give a presentation now, I've made the slides using ChatGPT. I can focus on the voiceover, the interaction with the audience. Those in my business are higher margin, higher value things. And I think that the ability for AI to do that, people seeing that and that opportunity, that would be the biggest misconception that I think people might be missing that right now.
But to go back to your earlier point about what you might advise your young children going into college about the need for critical thinking, are we creating a generation of prompt engineers versus critical thinkers?
If we do not thoughtfully design the way we teach kids how to use AI and the classroom experience, we could definitely risk in that direction. But I think we can do better. We integrated hardware and software into the classroom before, and there's like mixed success and failures along the way. Let's be honest. I see this with my own kids and screen time. Okay, but like we got to be thoughtful how we design this. And America at least has a pretty decentralized education system. And so you'll see state and local, I think, taking a big role here to figuring this out. So no, don't want that to happen. We need to teach kids how to do critical thinking. But I think the right kind of critical thinking interact with massive intelligence at a low cost. Oh my gosh, sky's the limit. But we got to get that right. I'm with you.
All right, let's keep going. So what is the most important economic indicators or related to AI that you check? Every morning, every week, whatever. Is that a metric?
There's not one metric out there right now that says, here's the state of the AI economy. What I do look at is I look at the markets. I try to understand, because it's particularly sort of the global markets, a lot of them are driven by AI right now. I tend to look how they're performing, and often it's coming down in terms of the composition to a few key stocks that are really sort of in many ways AI plays. And so I think that's one way to look at the health of the AI economy. It's a pretty coarse way. And then I do look at sort of job separations in terms of people jumping from one job to another, as well as like sort of the unemployment statistics in the US and around the world monthly or at whatever cadence they would come out in other parts of the world to kind of see how things are going in terms of potential impacts from AI either way. Those are the two things I spend a lot of time thinking about.
Okay. And what about your favorite economic thinker that influences your own views on AI?
I have many, but I'll say the one who's on my mind because I just spent some time with at Stanford is Eric Brynjolfsson. Eric is a fantastic economist at Stanford who had really, he's been really studying AI since in some ways the mid 80s, if you really go back to what he's been doing. But he's really been at every technological transformation, a key thinker in understanding how it's going to affect business and society. And Eric is someone I pay a lot of attention to in terms of what he's thinking and what he's building at Stanford. Really amazing person.
Great. All right. So you've been at OpenAI for a little bit. What is the most surprising trend that you've noticed at OpenAI since you started? Or, was there a difference between what you thought OpenAI was going to be from the reality of it after you joined? Either one.
Yeah, I'll say that on the second, and two versions of this. One is, I think I said before, the research orientation is just mind-blowing. I am a university person. I spent my life after doing my PhD teaching research. I love this stuff. And I thought I was making a real transition, and I come in and I feel like, wow, I feel like I'm a student again. And that is I will tell anyone, after you've reached a certain age, that is a true privilege to be a student again. And I do feel that here. And I think that was a huge surprise, thinking I was going to come into something that was going to feel very different. I think the second thing I'll say is the questions you've asked and the question that many people are asking me when I go out and speak around how's this going to change our world? What's going to be the impact? Inside OpenAI, whether a person has a very practical job, trying to sell to enterprise or design the product so more people are using it, whatever it might be, those folks all have those same questions. And I feel like these questions of like how it's going to shape our society and our lives, everybody's asking those. And I feel, I guess, even more conviction that like a big part of my job is to try to figure out evidence-based answers. They might take a little longer than people want. They might not always be on trend or be able to be summarized in exactly the right LinkedIn post, but like really finding evidence-based answers to those questions, I become sort of more convinced that that's really important because I get those questions not just from the usual suspects, but from everyone at the organization.
Interesting. Okay, we'll end with the last question. What keeps you awake about AI? I mean, I'm sure you can be awake because you're super excited or super anxious. So which is it?
I'm excited. So that is keeping me awake. But I'll say, no, we have to get the transition right. The things you asked about are really just right on. I don't have all the answers. I'm working hard to try to develop them. But we have to get this transition when AI becomes more powerful and able to do more in the economy to make sure that people have the right skills, both to do their jobs better and flourish, but also to take these new opportunities that might exist. If we don't get that right, if our institutions aren't strong enough, if we're not together on the same team to make that happen, it will cause negative effects that could be avoided. And I think if I, in my little small way, can help avoid a few of those things, man, that would be the accomplishment of a lifetime. So that's really what keeps me awake at night, making sure I can contribute to solutions.
Ronnie, it's a great pleasure to talk to you. I learned so much about what you do and some of the important issues. Thank you once again for just illuminating all the key aspects of AI regulation and the economic impact and some of the things that we all should be thinking about as an industry. Hopefully I can have you come back in a year and tell us how you've done in OpenAI, and maybe there'll be other challenges that you're grappling with. But
I'm sure.
Thank you once again.
Sure. Thanks for having me, and I'd love to come back and look forward to comments and feedback as I'm learning all these new things. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Yuan. Thank you once again, Ronnie. I really appreciate it.
Cool.
Thank you for tuning in to the Tech Surge podcast from Celesta Capital. If you enjoy this episode, feel free to share it, subscribe, or leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. We'll be back every 2 weeks with more insights and discussions of all things deep tech. Bye for now.